So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the messy work of making a visual medium accessible, tactics and techniques for audio describing unflattening. This event is co-presented by the Longmore Institute on Disability and Comic Studies at SFSU. My name is Shayna Garaya, and I am Longmore's Access and Events Coordinator. Before we dive in, I'm going to go over some access notes, which are also available in the chat. If you'd like more customized, reliable captions, they're available at tinyurl.com/Longmore captions. Our FAQ for this event today is linked in the chat. And we've turned off attendee communication through the chat in order to improve access. But please use the Q&A as if it's a chat space. So ask your questions, get tech help, and share your reactions to the discussion. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our moderators for today's program. Emily Badix is interim director at the Longmore Institute, and Nick Sousanis is a comic studies professor and author of Unflattening. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Shayna.
Thank you, Shayna. I think I'm starting. Thank everyone for coming out and joining us. Thanks our panelists. I'm just really grateful for all of your expertise and insights and thinking this through with us. Thanks to IDC, who we'll be hearing more about, and thanks Emily for pushing all this forward. I really appreciate it. I'm going to say a short, since this happens to be my work we're talking about, which is both exciting and a little bit awkward for me. I'm going to say a little bit about what it is and how this whole project has come to be over the last several years. I did Unflattening was my dissertation, probably the first to be drawn entirely in comics form. And my reason for doing it was I was interested in big ideas, but I wanted to make them accessible. But as I was doing it, I was aware that my medium of choice, there was an audience that it really left out altogether. And the fact that I focused on the visual for so much of the work, my whole metaphor really made that even more difficult. So over the years, I'd pay attention to ways that I'd see comics adapted for blind and low vision readers. And I just sort of collect them on my website. And then when I was hired here, I was hired at the same time as Yuting Su, who was a big part of our project until moving off from the university a year ago. And I'd ask her, I was like, is this a cool idea for adapting comics, or is this a sighted person's idea of a cool thing? And Ting would give me good insights on that. And then we had a student do a project in comics that we had to make ADA compliant. And instead of seeing this as a hardship, I said, well, this is an opportunity to let's see what best practices are. And so we started for an internal grant, which connected us to Emily. And we hosted a first roundtable with some of the people here today, and that blew up. Everybody was so interested. We thought it was a small, intimate conversation, and it really blew up, which led to us taking that momentum and doing an all-day symposium, which continued to have so much interest, and to the design competition we hosted last year. These things, there's just so much interest in it, and I feel very strongly that everybody who wants to read Spider-Man should be able to and follow his adventures. So it's a little bit of an accident that it's grown, but it keeps growing, and just really excited to see it continue. And then last year, again, slightly by accident, somebody asked me to do a project for MIT Technology Review and on accessibility. And I turned to Emily and said, we should make a comic about this. So we did that. And in the process of doing that, I said out loud to Emily, should we maybe, look at unflattening? Is that possible to even tackle it? So I'll hand it to you, Emily.
So then I would say I jumped a little too fast on the possibility of let's see what we can do with that. But really mostly just wanting to get a gauge of it, because everything that the Accessible Comics Collective had been doing, and even our comic for MIT were pretty small pieces. And so just being particularly excited at taking this to some of the messiest places and seeing what turned out. So, to think about Unflattening, which is a 220-page book, I think a lot of that is endnotes. So maybe it's somewhere around 180 to 200 pages of graphics and complex illustrations seemed like a really exciting challenge. So I reached out to some different description companies to kind of see who was interested in thinking about this and helping generate a budget of what that would even cost. And IDC Digital is a company that we had worked with a lot in the past, tied to the film festival that the Longmore Institute runs, Superfest. And I know they do really incredible film work. They've won awards for their audio description. And really wonderfully, they were very enthusiastic about like testing this and seeing. And we knew we weren't ready to dive fully into the project, but they offered the idea of like, well, let's just do a sample and see what this is like and use that to get an estimate of like how much time would this actually take and how much would this cost. So again, a huge shout out to IDC for the generosity and the gift of just a ton of time and thinking with us in this process. And I'll pass it back to you, Nick, for some of the conversations that then grew out of that.
Yeah, I mean, IDC's efforts and persistence to take on this tough challenge really made today possible. And so as we talked with them and listened to their sample as it came into existence, we wanted to explore, what are other ways, other things that we can attack this with? What are other approaches? And we've asked them so much already. We thought, well, we should offer some of these other approaches ourselves. Just see what is another thing that we can offer, and learn from each other. What are other ways we can expand the conversation? So in doing the samples, we go in a couple different directions. IDC's describes what's visually there, what is visually happening here that the sightless person needs access to. I took a version of it as the maker of it. So it's sort of, it describes like everything. It's exhaustive to the point of probably difficult to follow. But I also really wanted somebody to know what was on the page and why I had made all these connections on the page. And then Emily took the task of finding an approach that didn't necessarily have to follow everything I'd drawn, but it had to get what the ideas were on the page and make an engaging read. So we really like the idea, well, one, we really want to stress that these aren't ideas we put into competition. We're taking that no one size fits all. And, we want to see what are the best things that work for listeners, because it hasn't been done. And my work in particular is extra challenging in that way. And so I like that it gives us this way to learn from each other, and also like the very concept of unflattening, which those of you who've seen it will know. It's all about coming at things from multiple sides and getting an enhanced perspective. So we're hoping in having these three perspectives on it, it will help expand how we might approach this issue for future comics going forward. Back to you, Emily.
And I think that part of what we were trying to do, this is kind of repeating, but like in using your work, I mean, I really pushed you to be up for doing this and to make this a public program rather than just kind of having it be a quiet conversation, because you weren't stoked about like, oh, it's all about unflattening. But there really was a benefit to doing it all about unflattening, because your work is just so visually complicated. For folks who aren't familiar with it, I mean, some of it is very dystopian and just, really dense pages. Others are more like scientific drawings and diagrams. It's one thing to think about how do you make, a Charlie Brown comic accessible, and it's quite another to think about your work. And we had seen in some of the earlier sort of dialogues we were encouraging tied to this conversation of like, well, some things seem like you could make them accessible, but certainly not my work. And that's just sort of an anonymous person saying that. But we really wanted to use you as the guinea pig here to sort of show like, well, is it possible to do these really, really hard projects? And if so, then also there's no excuses. So this is all just a work in progress today, and the opportunity today is to learn together as we kind of see what's working and what isn't. So we're really grateful that so many people were interested in participating in this conversation. So thank you all for being here. So we're going to just, in case we sent out samples and everyone has the opportunity to listen to all 3 versions at any point if you want to. Those are all public links for you. But just in case everybody did not listen to all of those before coming today, we're going to give you a little teaser and play just one image and just a chunk of each version moving through one image. So you can kind of get a taste of what they're doing. So just to repeat, the first version is the IDC version that kind of just approaches it pretty similarly to how you would approach adding audio description to a film. The second version is Nick's artist commentary that is going to have things about the visuals that you wouldn't be able to just see with your own eyes if you're a sighted person, but that Nick is able to provide as the person who created those visuals. And the third is that narrative prose, trying to kind of focus on being more creative and engaging, but sometimes that means less direct translation of what's in the images. A quick note that while Liz and Scott, who are on the first track with IDC, they are professional voice actors, as will probably be quite clear. Nick and myself in the second 2 tracks are not. And even all 3 tracks, they're all drafts. There's stumbles and things like that. So thank you for bearing with us through those not quite perfect versions you're going to hear. So with that, Sheena will be able to play the versions. Thank you. One sec while we get audio going. And we have a slide up that shows the piece of artwork that will be described for folks who are looking for that visual access.
Give me 1 second for technical issues. Version 1.
The view displays the author's eyes in 2 panels facing directly toward us, first closed, then open.
In seeking new approaches for opening expansive spaces and awakening possibilities, let us look to our ways of seeing themselves, and how quite literally, the means to create perspective lies right between our eyes.
In a side-by-side view, one eye closes, then the other. A finger held aloft before the text, "Which view is true?" shifts to cover different letters as each eye closes. Below the panel with the left eye closed, the finger covers letters near the middle of the phrase. Below the panel with the right eye closed, the finger covers letters further to the left.
The distance separating our eyes means that there is a difference between the view each produces. Thus, there is no single correct view. This becomes evident by looking alternately through one eye at a time.
Version 2.
Immediately below these panels, on the left half of the page, is a 2x2 grid with the upper panels thin horizontal rectangles and the bottom panels squares with all sides the widths of the rectangles. Above the group of panels, the caption reads, "This becomes evident by looking alternately through only one eye at a time." The top row rectangular panels depict the same set of eyes from the top of the page in each of these boxes. In the first one, the left eye is closed, and in the right one, the right eye is closed. In the square panels immediately below each set of eyes, there are 2 pictures of the same left hand with index finger pointing upward. Only its location in the box is shifted to show the slightly different perspective from the vantage point of which eye you are using. There is text on a flat backdrop behind the index finger that reads, "Which view is true?" though the view of the text is partially obscured by the raised finger. Moving now to the right of this set of panels, there is a single horizontal panel sandwiched between 2 text boxes that shows the same scene yet again, but from directly overhead. The person, on left side of the rectangular panel, holding their left hand up with index finger raised in front of the poster, on the right side of the panel, that reads, "Which view is true?" The caption directly above this horizontal panel reads, and it is this displacement,
parallax, which enables us to perceive depth. And below the panel, another caption sums up the idea. Our stereoscopic vision is the creation and integration of two views. Seeing, much like walking on 2 feet, is a constant negotiation between two distinct sources.
Version 3.
To shift from the visual, the same experience can be approached through the oral by putting on a song in stereo mode played with headphones. With just the left or right headphone in, the song is noticeably incomplete. Yet when both play in tandem, the tracks unite so seamlessly that it's challenging to distinguish the separate perspectives presented the moment before. An additional example, by making a trip halfway around the sun, we essentially create two eyes a great distance apart. If we aim a telescope at far-off stars, say in this case the constellation of Perseus, which appears as if all the stars comprising it are near each other in the flat sky, and then note the view of each star at 6 months apart against a far more distant cosmic backdrop that doesn't change with the two views. The displacement of the observations from time 1 to time 2 allows us to calculate distances to these stars, thereby unflattening the night sky to reveal the vast depths of space. Those were our samples. I missed a note in my script where I wanted to give specific credit to the creators of the IDC version. It was written by Dakota Green and voiced by Liz Gutman and Scott Carroll. So with that, that's enough of our setup today. We want to hear and we want to learn out loud, as we said, with our experts who are going to give us their feedback, which is scary and exciting for us. So I'm going to ask our panelists to come on screen and introduce yourselves. So I'm going to suggest we start with Silvana and then go to Georgina and Josh, and just tell us a little bit about your connection to why we asked you to be here today. Thanks, Silvana. Oh.
Let me unmute myself. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Silvana Rainey. I've been in the blind industry training people who are blind and vision impaired for around 30 years. And I'm legally blind myself. So I'm also a devoted art lover, all kinds of art. I'm involved with the Blind Posse in San Francisco, a group that's dedicated to promote access in museums. I'm also involved with the Fine Arts Museums in San Francisco, working with access. So I am psyched to be here. This is an incredible project. I really agree. It is messy and exciting, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Georgina?
Hi, this is Georgina. Am I on?
You are.
Okay. Hi, I'm Georgina Kleege. I am a blind writer and disability studies scholar. Professor emeritus of English at UC Berkeley, which means I retired from there about 18 months ago. And I now live in New York City. Like Silvana, I am still a member of the Blind Posse, which, if people don't know, is a grassroots organization in the Bay Area, working with arts organizations, particularly museums, to improve their access. Now that I live in New York City, I'm working with museums here on the same project. And I'm excited to be here. This certainly is an ambitious project, and I really applaud the effort that's gone into it.
Thank you, Georgina. And Josh.
Hey, everybody. Josh Miele. I am a researcher and scientist and designer of accessible information for blind people. I'm blind myself and have been working in the field of accessible information of all different kinds for a long time. I've been blind since I was a little kid. So I've been really involved personally and professionally in finding new and better ways for blind people to get access to the information that they need in order to live and learn and enjoy the things they want to do. And in particular, I've done a lot of work in spatial information like maps, charts, infographics, as well as accessible video and video description, and of course, image description of arts and also STEM, science and math type graphics. So access to graphical information, spatial information, visual information. These are all really near and dear to my heart, and it is a thrill to be part of this panel and to be able to give feedback on how to make this really beautiful, complicated, and very interesting work more accessible for blind and visually impaired people. And I live in Berkeley, by the way.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Josh. Well, Josh, let's keep you on and have you start us off. So we're going to ask each of you to just start us big. You heard the full samples of the 5-page sample from Unflattening. I would love to just hear your general reactions. What do you see as the strengths and opportunities for each of these versions?
Yeah, and I want to, as usual, in my work in this area, I can come at this wearing a couple of different hats. I can come at this from my own personal preferences and likes and dislikes and appreciations, but I can also come at this from decades of kind of research and development on understanding how these kinds of things land with different parts of the blind community, people who have different blind experiences, which there are many, many different blind experiences, and mine is only one. So I first want to tell you how, and I'm going to try to be brief because I know I'm really excited to hear what everybody else has to say, but I'll tell you about my experience of this Unflattening project. I listened first to the IDC version, then I listened to Nick's version, then I listened to Emily's version. So for shorthand, I'll call those the professional version, the director's cut, or I'll call it the director's cut, and then the poetic version. So I really, when I found, and I'll, a little spoiler alert, I found the IDC version, the professional version, extremely confusing and disorienting. I found Nick's to be the director's cut to be the most understandable and comprehensive and really really interesting to me personally. And then Emily's I thought was gorgeous and also really good for providing an insight into what the material was. As one of the things that I think is really interesting about access to information and using description as a tool for access is that it's rare to get a single description that's going to work for everybody. When I use Yelp or Google, for example, to decide on a restaurant that I want to go to, I read the reviews, but I don't read just one review, right? I read a lot of reviews, and I can sort of infer from the tone and the type of things that the person has chosen to emphasize. I can sort of tell, what perspective they were coming from, and I kind of assembled these multiple perspectives into a mosaic of my own synthesis of what I think this restaurant would be like for me. And I think that this is a very similar situation. As some of you may know, I was really very instrumental and excited about working in developing a thing called UDescribe that allows anybody anywhere to add audio description to YouTube videos. And one of the great things that we found with UDescribe is that multiple descriptions often bring better perspective on what the video is actually trying to do. And I think we really saw that here. I have so much more to say, but I'm gonna stop. The only thing that I'll finish with, I guess, is to say that I think audio description tenets, the techniques of audio description, which work so well for movies and for video, don't do justice to this kind of a medium where the most delicious parts are in the detail and the relationships of the various parts of the images to one another, and where audio description needs to be extremely concise and conscious of the details that need to be omitted in order to move along with the timeline of the video. We don't have that constraint here, and it does well for the material to dive deep into it. And I think that one of the key factors that we have to grapple with here is how to allow a reader, a viewer, a consumer of this material to zoom in and out at will, so that they can get so that they can really sort of consume this in the way they want to, because that is a hugely important factor of what accessibility really means.
Thank you, Josh. And you gave us many little teasers for many directions we're going to go in with some of our questions to follow.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Georgina.
Yeah, I have much to say too, but I'll try to be succinct. The one thing I'll say that what was interesting about this whole exercise was that since I listened to them like Josh in the same sequence, the IDC, Nick's, and then Emily's, and by the, so there was a cumulative effect. So by the time I got to Emily's, I said, oh, I know what's going on here, because I'd already heard 2 different descriptions. And I sort of wish that I had somehow been able to, bring on amnesia, so that I would listen to one and then forget I had heard it, and so that I could judge better, but couldn't do that. Like Josh, I found the IDC version, and it may have been a function of listening to it first, was somewhat confusing. And it took me through the whole sequence to realize that the 2 voices, one was describing and one was reading text. And so I assume if this was, a full-on version, there would have been some explanation to say, this voice is reading the captions and this voice is doing the description. One of the things I really appreciated about Nick's version, I loved all the detail. I loved getting the artist's perspective. And it was very meaningful to me. But one point that stuck in my mind was where Nick says that he sometimes uses description as a kind of note-taking for himself, so that he gives himself a verbal description so that he can then, I guess, later enhance the drawing. Or also as a note to an editor to say, here's what's really going on here. I haven't, fully done justice through the images. And that that pleased me because, so often we think of a visual artist as just a visual artist, but visual artists are also verbal artists, and they, are accustomed to describing what they're doing in many kind of professional contexts. One of the things that I appreciated about Emily's piece was remarkably shorter than the other 2. To me, it felt like a kind of an interpretation, almost like a review or analysis of, so there was a great deal of synthesis of what was going on the page, as I understood it. And what was brought forth were the ideas that she was drawing from the visual and the verbal on the page. One final thing, and maybe we'll get into this more, is the thing that I always crave about image description in the visual art field, so in museum audio descriptions, is I sort of always want to know, well, what is the overall impact? How does this make you feel? I'm talking here to a sighted person. It's like, what are you feeling when you look at this thing? Is there some kind of mood that's being conveyed? And why? You know, so sometimes when I'm talking about just image description in museums, I'll ask people, where does your eye go first? And why? You know, what did the artist do to make you look at something? And then what happened? And I think that sort of sequence of visual perception, which seems is kind of a topic in the text here, is thinking about where, you know, does the reader always read from left to right, top to bottom, or is there an occasion where, wow, I zero in on this one thing in the middle, and then my eye moves around and zigzags and goes back and forth. And so, you know, and what does that feel like for a sighted person? I'll stop there. I have a lot more to say, but I'm sure it'll come out later.
Thank you, Georgina. That was really wonderful.
Silvana.
I think we all did the same thing. We read on a sense sequence. And so I read the 3 versions. I listened to the 3 versions, and then I stopped, left alone, and then I start the other way around, because I couldn't believe it that the audio description version, the professional audio description, made me so confused. I was like, well, maybe I didn't listen to this well, and let me go back to it. But it really did not give me the feeling of reading a comic. I used to love comics. I used to read comics. I went from comics for kids to the romantic comics to the superheroes, and you know, even Garfield and all those comics. And it did not give me that sense of reading a comic that, to me, when you read a comic, you also one of the characters. So I couldn't get in that way. The author's version, Nick's version, I really, really like it. I understood more what was going on. I agree the sequence of the panels are very important for me to understand the content and to get into the story. But I kind of got lost when Nick started talking about his inspiration, because to me it was like if I was in a play and in the middle of the play, someone would say, let's come to the backstage. Let me show you how this character came alive. And that broke the story for me a little bit. But I love knowing how the panels were, and basically the layout of the page and the relationship between the panels. And Emily's version, you should be reading for audiobooks. I love the way you read. I agree with Josh, was this creative writing, interpreting the visuals in a way that I could get really into it. But on the other hand, I lost the comic effect that you have when you read a comic, which is the separation of the panels, and you know, you can go back and forth and you can jump to the punchline, and I lost a little bit of that. So the 3 versions were very interesting to me, but at the same time, all of them I have to kind of work really hard and a visual and try to picture everything in my mind, that it took me out of the story a little bit. It took me out of the active reading a comic. So that was my impression. I like, you know, that the more we read, like Georgina and Josh said, you accumulate the information, and then you get more like, oh, that's so interesting, what interesting concept. But all of them left me a little bit like far away from the comic, far away from being in this story. Because like I said, I think when you read a comic, there's a lot left to the imagination, and you become one of the characters per se, or one of the author of the story.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that's a great way to connect in with what our next question is, which is, before we dive into some of what you all have just laid out and some of the nitty gritty questions we have about these approaches, is there another approach? Like, these three are what we came up with in this round of dialogue, but is there another direction of specifically audio description, that style that you wanted to see? And I also kind of want to invite Josh. A couple of people were really intrigued in the Q&A with what you said about zoom in, zoom out. So if that maybe is an opportunity to share a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I'll and I think that, pardon me, those two questions are obviously connected. And I often reach for technical solutions when for this kind of thing. And in our previous discussions about comics accessibility, we've talked about kind of a comics markup language of some kind. And I think that one does exist already, but I think I imagine something a little bit more that would let you navigate around to be able to interrogate, if you will, the page in different ways, in different places, to dive deep on one panel or on one character or on one particular feature. Some of the things that Nick was doing in his version was providing more information than was actually available to the viewer. If I had looked at the page with all of the different rows imagery, there was one, there were lots of references to different comic forms, comic artists. I wouldn't have known that in, because I'm comics naive. And because he sort of explained it, I was like, oh, that's really cool, but it's not there on the page. And so that's one of the, that's another area of divergence between the way we approach describing art and static images and the way we approach describing video. Again, in video, we really try not to interpret, because we don't want to tell the blind viewer what to think. We want to tell them what, describe what you see is the sort of prime directive in video description, but not in art description, because as Georgina pointed out, you want to know what the feel is, and what is the overall emotional impact when you look at this, which I'm not going to get if you just tell me about all of the panels, the shape of the panels. I need to sort of know what that does visually, and so that's another place where video description tenets and techniques really don't serve this material well. As far as zooming in and out, I hate to say it. I know we're I'm not a big fan of AI and all of the all of the hype. However, imagine being able to ask questions about any given panel. What is, where is this panel relative to this other panel? What is, what's at the bottom left corner of a given panel? What does, what's the aesthetic of a particular character or drawing type? To be able to actually interact with and ask questions about the images on a page, I think would be a very a very powerful approach for quote unquote zooming in and zooming out if it could be made reliable.
Thank you, Josh. Georgina or Silvana, are there other routes that we didn't even touch with these 3 samples you want us to think about?
This is Georgina speaking. One thing that occurred to me just now, hearing the snippets that we all listened to together, is maybe thinking about using a toolkit of techniques. So if we have these 3 different versions, but maybe there could be some selection of a style of description keyed to the particular page. You know, and so if it's something that's more regular, that there are panels, you know, in a grid of 2 by 2 or, you know, 4 by 3 or whatever it is, that might work better with a certain type of description. And then another page, which is maybe less formatted differently, might, you know, you might want to go to Emily's more, you know, sort of holistic, impressionistic approach. The other thing, and I'm taken with Josh's idea of the zooming in and zooming out, thinking about, you know, I remember a discussion years and years ago about UDescribe, and thinking about, you know, the need to know button, an idea that you could, the user could press a button and say, I want to know more about this, and that somehow there would be information supplied. And I sort of love that idea. But the other thing that occurs to me, because I've done this, where I've looked at something, even in a graphic memoir that I used to teach when I taught at Berkeley, where I would get multiple students to describe, you know, so that there would be, you know, so somebody would start with something and somebody else would add something. So there's a sort of cumulative effect. And if you could sort of take that as a starting point and then maybe edit it down, but to have sort of multiple perspectives going on, even if there were contradictions, or even if people quibble over language. For me, sometimes there's a, you know, it piles up. It's a decretive process, and you sort of get something, which is not necessarily a clear mental image, but it's, you know, I'm getting a reaction from multiple people, and that tells me something.
Yeah, you know, like I said, I listened to the 3 descriptions, and then I listen different orders, and then I stop and I listen to the first sample from the audio description perspective, and then I listen from the author, and then I listen from Emily, so I could compare. And I think there are elements in all of them that if we find a way to put together, it would be a perfect description. But I really think that if we start from the approach that Nick had, or giving more information about the art, the comic, it would give me a better understanding. But just take the background out of it, it would really makes the description more meaningful to me. And I agree with the zooming in and zooming out. I don't know how to do it. Josh is the scientist, and he will find a way. But, you know, just a way that we could ask and say, I want to spend more time with this panel and understand why this, you know, rose, it's on the left corner of the table. It got to be some meaning on that. Like Georgina say, why do we look at a certain area, people who are cited, of the page? So if there's a way to inquire, or to say, I went to spend more time here, because when you read a comic visually, you can do that. But if you're listening to the audio description, it's hard to go back and forth. You kind of lose the momentum. So I don't know how to do that, and Josh has an answer, but that's something I would like to see it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all. Goodness, there's so much to think about. I think I'm going on with the next question. Is that right, Emily? And I just a couple, I mean, this zooming in and out, I know I'm not really answering the questions, but leading up to this, just hearing all the versions, I kept thinking of sort of the accordion, like an accordion thing. Can we have something where you see one, and if you want more, you can pull it out and see more, and if you want more, you can pull it out further? And sounds like from Josh, your response is that some of this technology could be here, so that's encouraging. And I had one other just tiny comment, sorry, to Silvana. I think about description. Well, I'll leave it for now. Sorry. So my question is, this came with working with Emily's version as she was working on it, is that there's a lot that I very consciously try to not say. My work is all left in metaphor. So the most obvious thing, this is, spoiler alert, a work about education, but the word school, education, teacher never appear. So and often when I talk about the work, I do explain it, but when we were developing this third version, like some of that came out. And I think, you know, in Emily's successive drafts, we brought more and more out. But it is tricky in describing the visuals that keeping the ambiguity is harder. So part one of this question is, what advice do you have about how to navigate the balance of giving blind readers the same opportunity for interpretation in the journey of discovery? And then this is a sort of a second
Excuse me, a little slower.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's the question?
Okay, sometimes that ambiguity sometimes feels harder. So we're asking, like, what advice do you have about how to navigate the balance of giving blind readers the same opportunity for interpretation and the journey of discovery? And then there's a additional question here that's related. There's a lot of things in comics that can go unsaid, visual puns and similar things that the reader might make connections between the visual and the text, or they might just not notice at all. They might completely go unnoticed, or they might on the third read. But when it's described, and this is really noticeable for me while I was doing my version, it became annoyingly obvious. Like sometimes I'm like, here's something I said in the text, and now I'm telling you what it is because I'm describing the drawing. I'm wondering this second part, if I'm just too close to this as the author, or if some of those moments felt like too much over-explained as well. I don't know, Silvana, if you wanted to start, or if somebody else wants to jump in.
Well, you did two questions.
Yeah, I know, sorry. It felt related, but maybe I should have kept them separate.
Yeah, maybe, because I already forgot the first one. I see your moment. I think the only thing I'm gonna urge is, don't, at least that's my personal preference. I'm very concerned when we are overloaded with images and having to track everything. For example, if you don't apply a meaning to a certain thing, you lost me. When we're talking about the roses at first, at least with the audio description, it became so daunting. It's like, oh, do I have to keep track of this? Is this bouquet, you know, complete? What does that mean? So I had to keep track of how the leaves look like or the rose look like, and that it's a, you know, a hard balance when you need to give the information to the blind listener, but also when there is something that's like, it's too much. And I'm just reading a comic or even a book. So it becomes such a hard work for me to understand, or I'm so worried that I'm gonna forget about the detail that you just read 2 minutes ago and not putting the next detail together. That becomes a hard work, and that's an overload of images. So that's the kind of balance that I think it's very difficult to achieve when we are describing visual only. When you have a movie, or if it is a play, you know, there are moments there's silence, but also that's the moment of the action, or, you know, the character is speaking. So I don't know if we should think more about that, that when you have the caption, it should be given more time for us to think about it, but overloading me with images, it's really hard for me. I lose the pleasure of reading. So I don't know if it answers your question.
It's a great answer. I think a great answer. I know Josh, thank you, Silvana. Josh is waving. Oh, Josh, you're muted.
Thank
Yep.
you. Thank you. I just want to sort of highlight this really interesting continuum of accessibility and alternative formats and alternative materials. And they're not really the same thing. When I talk about accessibility, what I'm really talking about is creating a way for people with disabilities to participate equitably and with a very similar experience to the way the non-disabled participant would. And so that that includes the factor of sort of how much time it takes, how you get at it, how you approach it, what impact it has on you emotionally and physically. So that's what an accessible experience, but it's also possible to create alternative experiences that try to sort of convey maybe the same information, but are quite different from what the experience of the primary material might be. And so this gets into questions of you know, I don't want to nerd out on this too hard, but, you know, ekphrasis, which is the Greek word for art about art, you know, writing a song about a poem, or writing, you know, composing a play about a painting. And that's what Emily really did in, you know, in the one that Emily presented is really a complete reworking of the material with alternative ideas, including, you know, audio equivalents instead of the visual equivalents that Nick originally used. And there's a big difference. And I think that if we are talking about accessibility of a comic or accessibility of the material, we have to sort of decide how far into how far away from the original we're willing to veer before we start calling it a different work. And I think, you know, this is not a new question, but I think it's key to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's great, Josh. And it is really what we pushed with on the third version, and Emily brought to life so well. Georgina, did you want to tackle this one as well?
Well, I'll just add on, you know, it's sort of obvious, but, you know, here we're talking about a comic that existed, you know, was made at a certain date. And now audio description is being applied to it after the fact. And so the question that I would put to you as the artist is like, okay, so from this discussion, you can sort of think about what works, what doesn't work, and your own, you know, your own review of the material. I mean, it's not as if you have to be blind to listen to audio description. But then the question would be, well, now, if you wrote a comic now that you wanted to be multiply accessible, what would you do different? How would that change the form for you? Because I think, you know, I mean, I'm always, when I talk particularly to like disability art performers, theater, dance, so on and so forth, I'm often kind of irritable because they'll say, "Oh yeah, we're going to do the audio description. You know, we'll do that later." You know, and I have come to think, well, later is too late. Later is already too late because the artwork exists, and then you're laying on this thing on top of it. What if you started with description and then did the visual and the verbal artwork on top of that? And the other thing that there are a number of artists I know who have done this sort of project is, you know, that someone will paint a painting and then they'll get someone to do a description, or someone will dance a piece of choreography and they'll get someone to describe it. And then they'll send that description to somebody else, to another dancer, and that dancer will perform it from the description. And then that will be described. And so it becomes this sort of train. And, you know, does the final description in that train in any way resemble the initial work of art? I mean, it's sort of an interesting experiment, but sort of thinking about, because, and this goes back to what I said, Nick, about the detail in your description about how you describe your work to other people, you describe it to yourself. So, you know, that impulse, that procedure is already in your head. And what if that was sort of a starting point rather than, you know, something added on later?
Yeah, yeah, it's really, it's a lot to think about again. I really appreciate it. There's so many things I want to now like talk for an hour about, but I'm gonna move on to the next question just for time, and I'm gonna summarize the question that I'm skipping. The next question was about my description and how much I thought page composition was important. Though it didn't necessarily make for fluid reading, but I think we've tackled that with some of your responses already. But as the follow-up here, when I was describing, I was describing the page that is about sequential art, and it's very much about comics. And the page itself moves in this snake-like game board path. It's now being presented on screen, and this is the tactile one that people were given. As I was describing it, and what you see on the screen is a white piece of paper with a sort of snaking game board textured thing, and there's some braille elements on it, and the braille elements are simply saying which numbered caption they are, as well as there's a couple things that are off the game board path, and it's identifying what those elements are. And there's a couple super simplified drawings of the things, and then a little bit that's less simplified. But as I was describing this page in particular, I realized that I wanted you to know what the page felt like. I wanted you to know all the moves, because the moves were important. But I also knew, till Silvana's earlier point, there's no way that all the different moves, you couldn't keep track of them. It's just too much. This overload of information was definitely there. So I thought, I mean, the way I develop my pages are with these diagrammatic thumbnails, where I'm thinking about the movement of the eye, and I'm thinking about how the pieces fit together and the reading flow and how the captions move. So I simplified the page to sort of keep the elements of where you would be, so that it would be something you could listen to the description. Now, that was the hope. You could listen to the description and sort of, you'd know where you were, and then each caption would trigger where you were in the narrative, as a way to sort of allow some of the non-linear things that I'm doing to be preserved, even though it's impossible to describe something non-linearly. I have to keep, going left to right, top to down. So with the exception of the last little bit with the flying figure, I got rid of all the actual imagery and kept that in description because it's way too small. And I'm just curious how this worked, if it worked at all. I don't know that it's necessary for if it worked. I don't know that it's necessary for all of the pages because some are a little simpler in their construction. But I'd just be curious, just because it was an experiment to try, if it had any significance to you, or any promise or any other directions to explore with it. And I can't see anybody, so if somebody's raising their hand, anybody want to tackle this one? Should I pick somebody? Josh, do you want to tackle it?
Of course.
I figured you I could count on it.
So, I mean, and this gets to something that I really wanted to mention earlier, which is that we've been really privileging the technique of description in our comic accessibility conversation here. But in fact, because there are so many different ways to be blind, so many different blind experiences, and they involve different levels and different kinds of vision, and people utilize that to different extents, description is really only sort of one of the many ways we could approach comics accessibility. And the fact that you created this tactile to go along with your description is a great example of mixed media, mixed accessibility media to try to get at, leverage some of the spatial concepts that comics are so good at using and as a communications tool. So I thought I really loved the approach of using a spatial framework for kind of holding the concept, for as a companion to the description. And I think that, one of the things that I've done a lot of work in is what we call audio tactile graphics. So graphics that you can touch that also have a way of allowing a computer or other tool to sort of describe or give you annotation about the parts of the graphic that you're touching. And I could imagine that that would be a very powerful approach for this kind of a, page, again, with the zooming in and zooming out, allowing you to focus in on a particular part of the page while getting a really great overview, as it were, a spatial overview of what the page is how the page is laid out and what it's trying to communicate. I could imagine this working really well with some of the other pages that you described as well. For example, the rose page that Silvana found sort of a little overwhelming, I think would be a really great way to make a multimedia version of it, where you've got the frames and the picture, the shapes of the frames, which are also meaningful, especially down in the lower left, where you start to, have them non-orthogonal and stuff. And to be able to touch the different parts of the page, hear the descriptions, and maybe even drill down to get more information, like about, what does it mean that these, that these letters are drawn in this way? Who's the artist most known for that, et cetera, et cetera. So I love the idea of sort of mixing it, and imagine not just a tactile, but an abstracted visual for people with who still use a bunch of their vision, but who are overwhelmed by lots of detail. So there are lots of ways to create sort of multimedia accessibility concepts for this that preserve the spatial aspects of the page.
Thanks, Josh. That's great. And again, I mean, coming from multiple angles is so much the point of the work. So that's great. Silvana, are you coming on?
Yeah, I was just saying, here's an idea. Hey, Josh, why don't you create something that you'd have the page and we put our finger on, and then we want to know more, we press and we have the description.
Things like that already exist. We can use them.
But we can use them, but for comics, that would be a very interesting, because I actually love the comics, the bubbles that you have when someone speaks, and like I said, some elements like, when idea happened, you used to have like a light bulb, and it would be cool to experience that with our hands. That page was a bit hard for me. It was a bit hard. It was a great idea, but I have to say at the end of it, it was very hard for me to distinguish things and to feel, especially at the end of the story. I could see this, you know, figure out the sun and all of that. But, you know, to have different medias to explain something, it's always good. I'm not very good with tactile art by itself. I need a description to go with it. So it's very interesting. The concept is interesting. The page was a bit hard for me.
Thank you. Georgina, did you want to take this one too? Or?
Yeah, I'm with Silvana. I'm not an expert at tactile graphics. I mean, what I appreciated about it was the pathway. So then, because I'm interested in where is the viewer's eye going, and it's going in this, it's not in a predictable way. So it's taking this funny path. And then the different images that are described. And I think even in Emily's email about it, they're saying that the flying man at the end, I mean, I think it's just too small to really discern with a fingertip that's, I mean, I had to be told that was a flying figure. I mean, I sort of appreciated it, and in a way, the description helped me read it. If you had just sort of sent this to me without any, I would say, I don't know what I'm looking at here. But this discussion is making me think now. So Josh is going to deploy this technology where we could touch and hear description. I can tell he's already sketching a plan for this. Touch, and maybe you touch harder and you get more description. But one element that I think a lot about with audio description is vocal performance. And I was struck by it because Emily was disclaiming about how Nick and she are not professional voice actors, but as Silvana said, Emily has a great voice, and so does Nick, and it was lovely. But I'm also thinking, have you ever heard like a child reading a comic to another child, a younger child or something like that, where they naturally go into a voice for the different characters? And, maybe it's a scary voice, or it's a funny voice, or, whatever it is. And I'm thinking that I think it's something that could be done, because standard audio description for, movies, Netflix, whatever, the rule is there's this kind of neutral voice that's not interfering with the action. And I have some problems with that, but I accept it, that's kind of the standard. But I think with something like this, that maybe to think about audible communication. So not just the words that are being spoken out loud, but how they're being voiced, how the voice actors are acting. And if that contributes something, conveys something that maybe would be subliminal, would be, hitting the auditor, the listener on a subconscious level. But that might be something interesting to play around with.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Silvana's jumping in.
Well, as well as like the elements, it's like, when you had some cartoon where a brick falls on a character's head and there's a splash, or, that's the kind of thing I want to hear too. It's not just the voices, but the effects of an action or some elements on the page would be make your reading, more interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, we are moving. I could listen to you all talk for a
Yeah.
lot longer than we have scheduled. So I'm feeling pretty bummed right now, but we are getting some incredible questions in the Q&A, which I just want to say that even though we might not get to all of them, like Nick and I have spent hours and hours thinking about this, and or we're going to spend many more. So please keep asking those questions because we'll still use them to guide things, and we'll try to get to a couple of them in a minute. Before we go into those audience Q&A, I want to ask you, Nick, about your experience, like seeing your work separated from your artwork, and, you know, just if you gained any insight into your own work by participating in this process.
Yes.
That's the right answer. Yes.
I thought you were reading question 8 there. I was ready for that.
Sorry, I
one.
jumped ahead.
You jumped ahead of me. I mean, it's, you know, to Georgina's point about thinking about these things beforehand, it's definitely started to think about that. I mean, I thought about, can I make a chapter where that's like built into how I'm doing it from the start? Yeah, I mean, you know, some of the annoyance at myself at like, they feel like writing ticks when you see this sort of repetition that's in the disc, which also, as Josh pointed out, is appreciated because you want to know what those things are. I don't know, it's made me look so closely at it and think so much about what comics can do and how that's both really powerful and also just really complicated to pull apart, and to pull it apart in a way that's even remotely meaningful. I mean, I'll just say back to 3 years ago, in just about, almost exactly 3 years ago, we had this panel and I was like, all right, this is gonna be great. We're gonna find this, somebody's gonna have some ideas and we'll have best practices for making comics adaptable. And Josh said, you know, very plainly, one size does not fit all. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. I'm learning so much more. And this is a much bigger challenge. And here we are 3 years later, more events, more of our thinking. And I feel like even though I don't know that I feel any closer to the answer, I feel like it's expanded on how I think about translation, adaptation, and what comics can do. And I'll say one last thing, thinking about the version that you did, Emily. I mean, I kept pushing, I've been a fan of Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, and her comments on past translations of it, and like comparing passages she did with passages of past all male translators of it, and like why you make those choices. And I think it's really interesting to think about, and thinking about somebody's work. Like, you know, I'm focused on what the images are doing, and somebody else might be focused on, you know, what they see straight ahead, and somebody else might see what is the page about. And there's just so many ways to come at it. And I really do want to see this thing where you can press harder or whatever it's going to be, and get a different kind of depth of experience.
Yeah, in case there's any funders out there today, we've got a lot of ideas coming up, so you know how to connect with us and Josh and our panelists. So there are incredible questions in the Q&A. Shayna is going to lead us through some of them. Thanks, Shayna.
Yeah, so hello everyone. This is the voice of Shayna. The Q&A is on fire right now. And so thank you for your engagement. We're going to try to briefly get to as many of these as we can. So the first question is from Sean. I'd be curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on the limits, whether conventional or technical, on alt text in various social media and composition software, which constrains the ability to add descriptive text to images like comics pages. To that point, there's another similar question where Alice would like to know more about the technology Josh mentioned is already available. So Josh, is it okay if we start with you for this?
Of course. So I'll take the second question first. The tools for creating audio tactile graphics have been evolving since the late 80s, early 90s. And the most the most well-developed tools are being created by a company called Touch Graphics. You can look at them at touchgraphics.com. There's a thing called the T3, which is really probably the most sort of sophisticated and highly developed tool now for doing audio tactile interaction. There are lots of other ways to do it. There are ways to, the T3 uses a touch screen and tactile overlays. There are other ways to do it using cameras or smart pens. So it's really not, the devices don't need invention. The devices, you know, I think it's the media that needs to be experimented with. So the medium, I guess. So I encourage people not to reinvent these tools, because that's a very hard problem that people have been you know, working on pretty diligently, and I think we've got some good tools to play with. And then the other question was about alt text, and I'll just say that I think that some of the tools, alt text is a way of associating a fixed description with a particular online image, and some development platforms limit the number of characters that you're allowed to put into alt text. There's no actual real limit, but there's an artificial limit that some platforms place on the size of alt text. There's a practical limit. I mean, how much description does somebody want to really listen to about alt text? Alt text is really not ultimately designed for high quality, in detail image description because of its unstructured nature. It's just a piece of text that you're allowed to associate with an online image. And for stuff like a page of a comic, you really need to structure that data in order to make it more useful to a person to navigate. So I think that there are multiple issues around using alt text to describe complex images like we're dealing with here.
Thank you, Josh. Would anybody like to briefly add anything? Silvana.
No, I was just thinking, you know, Josh explained it really well, of course. It's more of the application of the technology, but also we got to think about what do we need to leave out when we describe things using alt text too, because describing every little bit of thing, it's exhausting.
Which is why zooming in and out is so important.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. So Silvana, while you're here, I want to ask a question specifically that came in for you. Would expanding sound design help make the final product more comicsy? And I know you touched upon this, and the question goes on to ask, to use Emily's stereo comparison from her description, perhaps that's an opportunity to play with stereo when mixing of the audio, and or would producing it like a scripted podcast be desirable or distracting in the way it uses sound effects and music?
I think it depends on the sound effect. I think at the previous gathering we had talking about this, we discussed about, you know, turning the page and having a sound for it, which it's really cool. I think if it's used well, it can enhance the reading experience. I think what's very important is to focus on the experience that you're going to have. And if in adding some sounds to the reading, it might bring some good experience when you're reading and extra information that it doesn't need to be conveyed by words.
Thank you for that. Thank you. All right, so the next question is specifically for Georgina. I find creative interpretations in Georgina's sense to be the most interesting adaptations of artworks. But is there some sort of assumption of neutrality or interchangeability that makes us shy away from such interpretations when trying to provide access through alternative media? That is, are we trying to get close to the original work? Trying to avoid creative interpolation? Is that even possible? That's a pretty good, big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. I mean, I've said and written for a long time that, I mean, there was a, kind of standard rule about objectivity, that was kind of the goal. And I mean, I say it all the time. I think objectivity is impossible and maybe not even desirable, because anytime you start describing, a page of a comic or a painting or whatever it is, whatever words come out of your mouth first, that is already an interpretation. You're already making a decision about what, where do we start? What's most important, whatever it is. And so I've always said, embrace the subjectivity. I know that there's a human being who has looked at something and they've tried to translate it into words, and that's going through the filter of their own perception. And so I don't need a pretense of some kind of objective neutrality. It's like, okay, this is Emily speaking, and Emily says this. And I say, yeah, good. I'm happy to know what Emily thinks. And I know that Emily is a person and she's a thinking person, and this is what she's come up with. And yeah, so that I think there's also, we need to think about what are we describing. So there's a difference between describing a comic, describing a painting, describing a graphic, how to put together some gadget that you just had delivered and didn't realize that there was some assembly required, sort of thing. In that case, I would want, very specific, information. Whereas if it's a work of art where there's some kind of emotion involved, I would want something that's much more leaning into subjectivity and expression, impression, and so on and so forth. So I think there's always thinking about context matters in what techniques might be used.
Definitely. Thank you. All right, so this next question is, I wonder if the panelists or other viewers have experienced accessible manga or comic descriptions, and if there are successful styles, examples, if they could suggest where to find them. Anybody can jump in for this one, just wave your hand around. Silvana is shaking her head. Emily?
I was going to say that we are seeing some new audio description coming out with some of the bigger mainstream comics. Not a ton, but like some of the ones meant for kids have had some audiobook. They're really being built as audiobook versions. I haven't seen any yet for manga. And I could have missed some, but I think we would have seen if there were like a lot of options out there.
So is manga, I just have to ask a clarifying question. Is manga specifically static book format, or does that include like animated versions?
I take it to just mean comics.
Okay.
Static.
Yeah, I haven't come across any great versions of it, but I think that, if it did, one of the really interesting, I keep sort of harping on this difference between audio description for video and audio and description for comics and other static images. There are so many differences in how these should be approached. One of the things that one of the standard do's and don'ts for audio describers of video is don't describe the shot, don't describe the cinematography, describe the scene as it is viewed. So don't say, fade to black or, long shot, so and I think that's quite different here. You really need to sort of take those these differences really need to be taken carefully, and this gets to describing the brush strokes and the image style. If you leave that stuff out of comic description, you're making it, you're filtering important parts of the style that should be included. Whereas in video, if you overemphasize that, you're really taking the viewer out of the experience of watching the movie by sort of making it overly technical. But again, you got to be able to sort of zoom in and zoom out on the level and kind of information that you want at any given time when you're consuming this kind of content.
Thank you so much. All right. So thank you to all the attendees for your engagement and enthusiasm. I'm now going to throw it to Emily.
Well, we had many questions for you that we could have kept going and going, and then amazing questions in the Q&A. So it's just so clear that like this is just something that's growing, and with every question comes 3 more, which is just a kind of call to action with so many of the people who we have on today, just seeing the rich backgrounds of so many of the participants who are coming from comics, lots of artists saying that they've never thought about this possibility before, maybe even a few in the publishing industry, and many access professionals. So we invite you all to be a part of this ongoing conversation. We will send you some resources and a Facebook group where you can get involved and ask more of your questions and keep this dialogue going. And maybe I just close with saying that one of the questions that we didn't get to today was going to talk about, like, is there ever anything that's just too visual that you would just be like, it's a waste of time, don't bother, it doesn't seem possible. But I feel fine not asking that question, because I do think that if we, these are still drafts, and we got a lot of great feedback today of like different directions to take them in and ways to grow, but certainly didn't hear anything that was like, nope, don't try, don't do it. And just in the last 3 years since Nick and I have been doing this project, being able to meet more and more people who say that they are in the blind, low vision community and comics do have meaning to them, or there is a desire. And thinking, Nick, part of why I wanted to use your work is that your book has been used as a textbook in just so many college classrooms around the world, and just wanting that opportunity for a blind student to be able to be in those classes too. So thank you to our panelists for this incredible feedback and pushing us, and compliments too. Those were great. But all of it, I just love the time to talk with you all, and I look forward to more, whatever that looks like. So thank you. Any final words from you, Nick?
Just so grateful for all the insights and your time and all of it. And then the audience too, your questions were amazing. I couldn't really keep up with things, but I'm going to read them all, and I wish we had a whole day for this now. So and it happened to be about my work. So for people to think about that for so long was really an extra treat. But just to hear you all think about how this can be done, I think it should be done for all comics. So I hope this helps move it a little bit farther down that path. So thank you all, and I can't wait to talk more.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.